So for those of you who are new, I'm Brandon Formby. I'm the urban affairs reporter for the Texas Tribune, and we're going to have a little discussion on the future of urban mobility. Our panelists we have Dallas City Council member Philip Kingston, who is serving his second term.
I think that's right.
Mr. Kingston has become, up in Dallas, known for being an advocate for a lot of mobility issues, for more efficient public transportation, for complete streets, and for rethinking how we plan cities and how we plan transportation. Next to him is John Michael Cortez, who is the special assistant to Austin Mayor Steve Adler. He's previously a community involvement manager for Austin Capital Metro and currently a board member for the Center for Public Policy Priorities. And then next to him is Ginger Gooden. She's the director of Transportation Policy Research Center here at Texas A&M at the Texas Transportation Institute, which the legislature created to provide data-based transportation research. She's an expert in a lot of areas, including managed lanes, mileage-based user fees, and autonomous vehicles. So we have a lot to discuss. I'll just go ahead and dive in. And my first question is to each of you. And congestion in major urban areas in Texas is getting worse. And definitely people's perception of it, or they perceive that it's getting worse. The governor has declared, or created this Clear Lanes initiative, directed TxDOT to fix, specifically congestion and choke points in the urban areas. TxDOT's already, spending billions to untangle some of these areas. But I want to ask y'all, what do each of you see as maybe the top 2 or 3 approaches that you think would best solve congestion? And I'll start with you, Mr. Kingston.
And I will go ahead and beg your question, because congestion is not a problem. And
Okay.
Texans who complain about congestion are living in the wrong place. Congestion is a sign of economic vitality. It's a sign of misplaced development priorities that cause sprawl throughout our Texas cities. And it really is not a problem for cities. It may be a problem for suburbs, and that's a different discussion. So the real question is, how do you make Texas sustainable? And the way to make it sustainable is to create denser cities with more modes of transportation. If your answer to congestion is lane miles, you will eventually pave over all of our metropolitan areas. We could give everybody a Porsche and pave over every square inch of urban territory in Texas, and we would still have congestion at 5 o'clock, because we all have to be in the same place at the same time. We can fix that through land planning, but it's a long process.
So if it's not lane miles, I mean, are there specific things that you think would solve it, or do you think it's something that can't be solved and the problem's being looked at all wrong?
Well, I think the problem is showing us the solution. It's don't invest in lane miles anymore. Don't invest in capacity, because that fundamentally doesn't work.
Well,
A guy who's got a $700 million road bond
I found
on
it.
the
I found
ballot.
it very interesting when I think it was Evan who mentioned that in a recent poll that y'all did that congestion, or it might have been transportation, came up as 10th as far as ranked priority of issues in the state. They must not have polled anybody in Austin, because every poll that public and private that's been conducted in Austin that I can remember over the last couple of decades, transportation and congestion has been the #1 issue, and it remains so today. I think there is a good discussion to be had about what congestion really is and what it means about the health and vitality of a city. I would much rather have a congested, prosperous, growing city than a moribund, uncongested city, certainly. But I think that, throw all that out, the public really wants us to do something about it. And at the end of the day, I think elected officials need to be, of course, very responsible about how they address issues, but they have to be responsive to the will of the public. And I do think, though, congestion, it is not just an inconvenience to people, it's also a real drag on our economy, and it is impacting our quality of life. I think in Austin, and Ginger probably knows these stats off, at the top of her head, but I think the average Austinite last year spent about 40 hours on average a year stuck in traffic. That's like, most people are lucky if they get that much vacation. I know I don't take that much vacation every year, but that's 40 hours a year that they're not at home with their kids helping with homework, that they're not doing whatever it is that they need to do to improve their lives and the lives of their family or pursue other opportunities. So I think there is a discussion to be had about the fundamental causes and the long-term fixes, but it is something that is very real to people and that we need to be addressing.
So what do you see as ways to give them that time back?
Well, I agree in principle with what the councilman said, is that what I think underlying his comments is it can't just be one solution. I guess the real answer is we need everything. We need not just lane miles, and I would argue, there are some places where investments in additional capacity do make sense, and there's something that we're actually trying to advance forward in Austin in lots of different ways. But we have to provide people wherever they choose to live or wherever they may be forced to live with a diversity of choices. They have to have lots of different ways to get around. Ultimately, changing our land use patterns is one of the most important ways for us to address urban mobility challenges, period. But that's a generational fix, and we have challenges that we can and should be addressing right now. So, it's not a specific answer to your question, which I can get into, but I think the answer is we need it all.
So, TTI has been studying congestion for decades, and it's a very complicated phenomenon to address. I would agree with Councilmember Kingston that we have some land development kinds of issues that are contributing to this. I think a lot of the sessions earlier have talked about the growth in population that we're going to be expecting, a doubling over the next several decades. That growth is expected to happen not just in urban areas, in urban centers, but in suburban areas. And so when you talk about the land development aspects of it, which are certainly important, what we have in the state are cities that are not designed like New York City or European cities, where options like transit become very difficult to implement cost effectively. I would agree with John Michael that people see this as an issue. We just issued our transportation poll that we do every 2 years this week. We asked people about congestion. People, in the range of 75 to 80% of people say they experience congestion across the state. I think what's also important as a factor in this is when you look at our major cities, when we ask people about what is your primary mode of transportation, it's their personal automobile at the tune of 88 to 94%. So that's the way that people get around. So what we have is we have a huge challenge with congestion. We've got to look at a number of different strategies, as he said, multiple strategies, and that's what our research has said over time. But we're talking about a behavior change too. I mean, people are accustomed to getting around in their car. Now we're talking about, shifting to other modes of travel and those being convenient in a way that gets them where they need to go.
Mm-hmm. But the problem is when you say all modes is the industry's new term for please don't cut off our damn funding. We know we need some little piddly light rail somewhere, but please don't cut off our funding. And the polling that's done will spark a whole round of media. I mean, this is one of those repetitive newspaper stories that, Brandon, you never wrote, thank you, but that every other transportation writer in the state writes twice a year when the polling data comes out that says the average Austinite spends 40 hours a year in traffic. Baloney. That's not true, for one thing, because we were looking at the MSA. And so the people who have actually paid the money to live in Austin don't experience it at the same level as the people who are complaining about it who live in Round Rock. Same thing happens in Dallas. Plano residents, yes, they're hacked off about congestion. Dallas residents, not so much.
One thing I want to come back, the fact that so many people and I think the latest numbers that y'all came out with this week were over 90% do rely on private automobiles. Is that because they're almost forced to, that's the only option they're given, and then it kind of do you think that creates like a cycle where it's like, okay, well, almost everyone like uses a car, so let's put all the money into roads, and then 2 years later it comes out and it's like, oh, like everybody uses a car, let's put more money in roads, and when the reason is all the money's going to roads, whereas, not to transit or to other options. Do you think it's like a self-fulfilling cycle?
Well, it could be, but I would say that there are cities in Texas that have tried to advance alternative modes, and there hasn't been always public support for that. So people are accustomed because it's the most convenient and the most reliable and the cheapest, in many ways, way to get around. The alternatives need to be cheaper, convenient, in order for people to make that behavior shift. One of the things when I talk about how the percentage of people that use their personal auto, we've compared that with our 2014 poll, and it's actually gone up. So we're going, the direction opposite of where we want to go, and the main reason for that is fuel prices. So fuel prices have dropped in the last 2 years, and we know this for studying this for years and years. As fuel prices drop, people drive more. So, is there a policy mechanism related to pricing that could influence demand? There are some tools out there that are not always politically acceptable, but are powerful tools that can be used to incentivize a behavior shift.
So do you think it's a matter of political will? Like, is that what's lacking?
Political will comes from public support. So when you have people who are, saying we want another alternative and we're ready to support it and we're ready to pay for it, and I think they don't have the political will.
But Brandon, I do think, though, the answer to your question is, in many cases, yes. And I know in Austin and in Central Texas, we have many areas of our region where there are no options. The only option is, if you're fortunate enough to be able to afford and own an automobile, to jump in it and drive. And the way that we have invested in infrastructure in the past, I think has been part of fueling that self-sustaining cycle of auto dependence. But I think we've gotten a lot smarter, at least from my perspective, over the last several years on how we invest. We may add capacity to a highway, but we're doing so in a way that expands and enhances other choices beyond driving. So, for example, we are working towards a system of managed lanes on some of our existing highways in Austin, which will provide much faster, more reliable, and attractive regional transit service that would operate in those express lanes. We have our largest mobility bond on the ballot for this November, and the bulk of that work would be to implement complete streets on some of those old TxDOT, it was referenced earlier, those old TxDOT highways that are really now urban arterials that were designed to be completely auto-dependent, don't have any drainage, don't have any sidewalks, don't have any bicycle facilities, are not very accommodating to transit at all, where our city has grown up around them and commercial uses have grown up around them. A lot of that money is to go through and make those streets serve all modes better. And it will have an appreciable impact on auto congestion and safety, but it also will have an appreciable impact on transit efficiency, have an appreciable impact on active transportation. So I think we've gotten much smarter about how we make investments, and I think that is, when you talk about the future of urban mobility, I think a lot of it is going to be about asking more out of our infrastructure. It's not just going to do one thing. We're not just going to be investing in infrastructure to try to solve one problem, which is peak hour congestion. It's going to be solving multiple problems, and I think that's the approach that we're in the process of.
And something that John Michael and Ginger brought up, I think it shows a real divide. John Michael's talking about what they're doing in Austin, which is very, very good work in a city that has been bedeviled by lack of consensus on transportation forever. In Dallas, we're doing the same thing with CityMap, thanks to TxDOT. But the state's going the other way. The governor's talking clear lanes initiatives, which is really dumb. I mean, this is a very bad way to spend money. And then we just walled off part of our budget that now has to go to transportation, that can never be spent on education, that can never be spent on fixing affordable housing, that can never be spent on any of the other things that the state is supposed to do, mental health care. And so it's a real weird divide. And I think part of the problem is, as Ginger mentioned, political will. Political will is being blunted by our insanely gerrymandered state. And the legislature has set up this horrible conflict between people who ought to be partners. I ought to be able to partner with Mayor Athas in Garland on transportation stuff. But instead, the state has gerrymandered these districts such that it's all about suburban versus urban. And right now, suburban has all the power. And we can't, those of us who want other modes of transportation do not have the governor's ear, as you can see from his policies.
So what do you see, how is that districting in that kind of suburban versus urban tension, how is that how do you see that impacting the urban areas, the cities? Like, how is it hurting them?
We are starved for transportation dollars. Rural and suburban projects get fully funded like that, and we get starved. We have needed, I mean, and it took forever for Dallas to get funding for the Pegasus project, which basically just straightens out a little bit of highway to solve one of those clear lanes problems that the governor was talking about. We don't have political power to get the funding that we need for the right kind of transportation. It wasn't until 2013, 2014 that TxDOT made its first investment in transit, in public transportation. I mean, this is and God bless TxDOT, it is rapidly changing. And it gave us this very valuable progressive plan in City Map that I think is going to, if we can match it up with funding, transform the way we do urban planning around transportation.
And I do want to come back to City Map, but I did want to ask you, on the bond proposal that y'all have you seen a difference or have you seen an impact in how the public is reacting to that by adding things like bike lanes, like adding complete streets, things more than just lanes? I mean, do you see that creating more opposition, more support, or is it just kind of negligible?
You know, I think it created more support, and we'll see what happens. So it's easy for me to sit up here and say that, but we'll see what happens. You know, I think the mayor described the bond package very well by saying if any of us in Austin were sitting down and putting together our own bond package, none of us would have come up with this. Because it's not perfect. It does try to build what, as the councilman said, we've been lacking in Austin, and that's a real consensus on how to address our mobility challenges. So we tried to put enough in there for everybody that it was difficult to say, I can't vote for that. I think if it's kind of weird because if you ask some folks, they kind of look at it, well, I really don't like that piece of it. It's got some bike lanes in there, and I hate bike lanes, but I really want them to do something about 360. So, and we'll see how that works. But I do think it has moved the conversation forward and beyond the set of investments which I think are going to be transformative for Austin and we desperately need. I think it has allowed us to have a conversation and reinforce that message that we need all of this stuff. We need it all. And it can't just be this one investment in this one mode in this one part of town. It all works together as a system, and we have to invest in it like a system. The other thing I think is really a great opportunity with this bond is to continue to build our relationship and partnerships with TxDOT. I'll jump on the bandwagon. I think what I've seen in my time with the mayor and before then is that TxDOT has been a great partner in Austin, and we're really excited about the future of our ability to partner with them on some really good projects. And I'm not just saying that because there's TxDOT people in here and I want their money, but we are very, very excited about coming to the table with significant local funding that we can leverage for projects that our city and our region desperately needs. And one more thing, Love what they did in Dallas with Clyde Warren and that project. It sure would be great to be able to do that with IH-35 through downtown Austin. I've been in and around transportation planning for a long time, or it seems like a long time in Austin, and I think there's strong consensus and community will to make the investment we need to not only address challenges on I-35, but to reconnect our community. IH-35 has divided our community for so long, but unites us in frustration. So I'm excited to actually make improvements on I-35 and stitch our community back together with the possibility of reclaiming some good public urban space on top of that.
If the measure passes, given that voters, rejected, a rail initiative just a few years ago, rejected, transportation networks, if this passes, do you think that then that will kind of cement an idea going to kind of what Ginger was saying, that like the people don't want these alternatives, they want roads?
Well, people from Austin may think I'm crazy when I say this, but in 2014, when we had a first investment in urban rail on our ballot that failed, I would argue light rail wasn't rejected. A property tax increase to pay for it was rejected. I think if we were to come back and put that same project in front of people and say, by the way, we can do this without raising your taxes, I think it would have passed overwhelmingly. We have had successful rail elections. Now that was for commuter rail. That passed with 64% of the vote, I think, because it didn't require an increase in taxes. That was a midterm election, didn't have the right voters, and it required a significant property tax increase. So I would say rail wasn't rejected because there's been a lot of polling done after the fact. It wasn't rail that was rejected, it was, I think, the funding and the lack of a comprehensive system vision. But the other piece is I do think, again, this conversation about needing everything will help us the next time we want to put something like that forward.
And you're talking about how 35 has divided Austin. Dallas has a laundry list of highways that have divided downtown and its surrounding neighborhoods. And you've been talking about City Map, which is a report that TxDOT came out with earlier this summer, about different options for rebuilding the highways around downtown Dallas. Where is when that came out, it was, almost universally hailed as a watershed moment in TxDOT. The transportation agency basically admitted, yes, we contributed to suburban sprawl. No, we cannot afford to do this anymore. And yes, these highways, to get people from here to the suburbs, we hurt urban neighborhoods. What has happened since that came out? And what is going on behind the scenes, or even out in the public, that's going to actually take City Map and run with it, so it doesn't just end up some other report that nobody ever takes action on?
Well, I'm very hopeful that second part won't happen, that this has real legs. But and I stole this idea from Philip Hague, who's sitting here with the Greater Chamber. We need a mechanism for linking the plan to funding, and that is something. He asked me, "How do you do that?" And I said, "I'm not totally sure about that." But City Map got started because a group of urbanists in Dallas essentially yelled loud enough. TxDOT was looking at I-345, which is the shortest interstate highway in the United States, 1 mile long. It links the northern end of I-45 to the southern end of US 75. And there's this crazy guy named Patrick Kennedy in Dallas who said, hey, what happens, because TxDOT was looking at refurbishing that elevated freeway, which was at the end of its service life. And he said, what happens if we just tear it down? What happens if we take out a highway? And as it turns out, lots of cities around the world have done this, and it almost always works out great, because the value of the real estate underneath that highway is worth many, many, many times the value of people taking that 1 mile shortcut from 45 to 75. So it works from an economic perspective. It works from an urban design perspective because it links back to neighborhoods that were historically connected and then divided by this this freeway. And lo and behold, Victor Vandergriff, TxDOT commissioner, who I don't know, he's visionary, I guess. He said, I'm going to do a study of all your downtown freeways. I don't want to give you an answer on just tearing down this one thing, but how does it affect the rest of the system? And they produced CityMap, which now everybody in Texas wants their own city map, and they should get one. And the most shocking thing in the study is that TxDOT declared feasible tearing down I-345. TxDOT said we could reduce capacity. And I think that is amazing, and I'm hopeful that we're actually going to do it. Where it is right now is supposedly still in the public comment phase. If you go to, I think it's citymap.org, I'm not sure, you can find it through TxDOT's webpage. You can actually online put in your commentary about CityMap, and I think they're targeting a release of the final version of the study in January. I sent them 20 pages of comments.
Well, I want to come back to you. We hear a lot about autonomous vehicles and how they're going to change everything. My first question to you is, I mean, do you see autonomous vehicles catching on, becoming something mainstream, something that most people have, most people use in the next 5, 10, 15 years? How far out do you think we are? And do you think it'll happen? And if so, how far out do you think we are?
So that's the question we always get as researchers. Realistically, what are we looking at? I would say just in the last 3 to 4 years, I've been amazed at the progress of the technology. What we're going to begin to see, and I think what Uber is doing right now in Pittsburgh by testing their self-driving cars in a Uber network, ride-sharing network, is the kind of use case, if you will, that we're going to see early on. That and driverless beer trucks like in Colorado, and applications to commercial vehicles. But you can look at Uber, what Lyft has been doing with their partnership with GM, what Google has been doing. It seems that is going to be kind of the early kind of test case. What I think that for public agencies and for cities in particular, to begin thinking about what that means in terms of trying to address this behavior shift. So what we see, for instance, in Dallas, I mean, DART on their mobile app where you can buy your train ticket or bus ticket, you can also go directly to Uber or Lyft or Zipcar and get a connection to your transit station using that kind of service. And there are cities across the country that are working with Uber and Lyft, for example, to find ways to provide what's called first and last mile service to transit. So for those people who transit is inconvenient for me now, here's an opportunity maybe where I don't have to have a car or don't have to drive my car, and I can connect to high capacity transit through this kinds of service. But again, that has a lot of testing to go, a lot of kind of demonstration to see whether people will accept that. For the notion of everybody having their own self-driving car and for that, to have a significant market penetration, we're looking at decades probably for that. But again, these kind of small applications and testing how they can be used in support of some of the challenges that we're facing with both congestion and safety. I think we can see cities really taking the lead in that over the next 5 years, 5 to 10 years.
And do you see, or what do you see the changes be once that happens? How is that going to impact how we build infrastructure, how we maybe fund it, how we plan for stuff like that?
Right. So I'll use a concrete example because I was talking to Capital Metro in Austin. So on I-35, one of the things that's being proposed is the managed lanes, price managed lanes, so that there's a separate lane for high capacity bus service from the suburban areas into the central city. But as I was talking to them, they were saying, in order to support bus service, what we know from the applications of high occupancy vehicle lanes and those kinds of bus lanes, you need to have the supporting facilities, like a park and ride lot. Well, what's the estimate on the park and ride lot to support the I-35 bus service is $100 million. They were saying, that's a third of my operating budget. So again, it comes back to the funding. Where do we get the funding to build the kinds of support facilities that we need for this? this is where some of these ideas, and I think in New Jersey, they're looking at how can we avoid building that kind of infrastructure and instead leverage an Uber or a Lyft or a TNC operation to bring people to the station rather than having to invest in infrastructure. So again, it's those kinds of ideas that will begin to percolate up and see how do we have some funding constraints, we need this infrastructure to support this. How does technology in the vehicle, in our hands, with the infrastructure integrated, how does that start to address some of the problems that we have?
I just add on to that, as your question of how are autonomous vehicles likely to change how we build infrastructure. I would suggest, and I'm far from the expert on this, but I would suggest it better not change it very much. We can't even afford to build the infrastructure we need today if the introduction of this technology requires us to make wholesale changes to our existing infrastructure and build new infrastructure. It's probably going to take forever for it to be adopted or useful. And I think that's the approach that a lot of the autonomous vehicle companies are taking. They're trying to create systems that operate within the environment we already have, follow our existing traffic laws, operate on the same streets without additional sensors and different kinds of signals.
In their own lane.
Or they're, in a regular lane.
Right.
So I hope that, because I think there is a lot of promise. I don't think it's really going to solve all of our problems, because our problems are not really, I would say fundamentally not really technological. They're more physical. We just don't have enough space in dense urban areas, and we have a lot of people competing to occupy that space. But they do hold a lot of promise for making the existing right-of-way, the existing space, the existing systems we have more efficient and more accessible. But I don't think it will work if the technology requires us to build a bunch of new stuff, because it's just too expensive, and we don't have the money for it, and it'll take forever.
Did you want to add anything?
Nah.
Okay. I'm gonna ask the two of you, what is there like one dream piece of legislation or law that could come out of the upcoming legislative session that you think would give you the tools you need to create the kind of urban environment, the kind of mobility that you would like to see? I mean, is there like, if you had to pick one thing, one tool for the legislature to give you, what would it be?
Oof. That is a phenomenal question. The legislature just kicks me in the teeth all the time, so it's hard for me to imagine them giving me something good. Maybe if TSEC would go along with EPA's urban air quality standards. Dallas has about double the state rate of childhood asthma, and it's entirely related to two factors. It's urban air quality, poor urban air quality, and substandard housing. We need to work on the substandard housing piece. The state, it'd be nice if they'd help us with the air quality piece, because what that would do is create a regulatory hard stop on sort of destructive transportation spending that makes our air quality worse. And if we could get that, I think we could derive a lot of benefits out of it.
Well, I'm going to cheat and not give you just one. I think the first dream would be, don't take away the tools we have now. And it was really refreshing, and I'm very appreciative of what we heard earlier today about the notion that cities and regions should be given the ability to choose the tool that makes the most sense for them. Whether it's managed lanes or tolling or something else, let us use the tools that are already at our disposal and let us use them as we see fit, within reason, of course. The other thing I would say, as far as new tools that would be good and be very helpful, I would say first, and I know this has been brought up in previous sessions, I don't know if anybody's going to pick this up and run with it, probably not, but it would be great to have a local option tax that our city or our region could say, you know what, we have dire infrastructure needs, We cannot rely on the federal government. We cannot rely necessarily, although the state's doing a much better job of funding TxDOT, it's still not enough. Our city staff told us earlier this year that we have close to $10 billion worth of mobility needs today within the city. And we can't rely on anybody else for that. We're going to have to do that ourselves by and large. Give us the tools to be able to take that on, whether it's a local option sales tax or some other kind of revenue we could raise ourselves. Let our voters decide whether they think that investment is worthwhile. That would be a tremendous tool for us. Again, I don't know if anybody's going to pick that up. I don't think we are, but if somebody out there wants to do that, give me a call. But I think there's some other things. Representative Israel, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that. I don't think she's here. I think had a bill that got out of the House last year that died in the Senate, and I think it passed the last couple sessions before that and was vetoed. And this is something very simple, and that's buses on shoulders of highways. They're doing it in, I think, 7 other states. It's a cheap, easy way to give transit some sort of advantage during peak congested hours. That would be a great tool for our region to explore where it makes sense. I think offering the telecommuting bill that she mentioned earlier would be a good one as well. I think that, again, I would just say give us a few more tools, but really just don't take away the tools we got.
That kind of leads me to my next question. And you said that you're used to the legislature kicking you in the teeth. Are there things that you would like for them to just not do? Are there things that, and not just at the state level, but the federal level, that get in your way or undermine what you are trying to do at the city level?
Millions of things. I wanted to. City attorney kept telling me, no, your sidewalk cafes can't have permanent seating and can't have permanent shade structures and anything else. And I said, why? And they were like, well, it turns out it's state law. Even on a city right-of-way, city owns the right-of-way. We are the fee simple owner, like you own your house. The state says you literally cannot put a permanent structure in the sidewalk, no matter how wide the sidewalk is, independent of ADA concerns, independent of anything else. And there are hundreds of similar problems where the state is meddling in the business of cities. It just drives me bananas. Legislators that will tell the federal government, stay out of our business, and sue the Obama administration 41 times, are telling cities, we're going to tell you when you can and can't raise water bills. I mean, it's the height of hypocrisy. And so to pick out one, I don't know. They should have sunset the TABC. TABC should have been sunset a long time ago. It exists solely to benefit the needs of distributors and for no other purpose. And the reason it's a problem for me locally is that I can't do anything to regulate the sale of alcohol. I'm 100% preempted. So we do all of these just crazy, it keeps us having to overpark our urban areas because parking is literally the only way we can control how many bars go into an area.
I forgot a tool that would be good. And I think all three of us discussed the need for changes in land use. Again, this is something that I think has been brought up in many previous sessions but hasn't really gone anywhere, and that's for places like Travis County and increasingly Williamson County, Harris County, Dallas County. It would be great for counties to have some more land use controls. As they really can't stop stuff from happening, and that's why we have to build why there's a demand for more and more transportation infrastructure farther out, because people are moving out there, because stuff is getting built.
Yeah, that's a great
and they don't have any control over that. Now cities, and the reason why you have a city like Austin that's spread out so much is because we annex a lot, because we want to be able to plan for that growth. Otherwise, we'll be caught in this continuous loop of being behind the 8 ball on infrastructure. So that would be one. Again, anybody going to pick that up, that'd be great. I'll be here. I'll be helpful as much as I can. But that's one that would be very, very.
Do you think that kind of land use, that kind of planning power would be best at the county level or at the like MPO level?
Well,
please
let's
don't give
let's
any
crawl
target.
before we walk. I think I would suggest the county right now. I think that I do buy into the notion that the government that's closest to the people, is good. Now, I will say that where you've seen much better transportation and land use outcomes across the country, I've been in those regions where they have a metropolitan governance, places like Twin Cities, Seattle, etc. But actually, Dallas is a great example. Although they don't have a metro government, I think their combined COG and MPO and the consensus they've been able to build around things has been instructive for all the other regions. So, for better or for worse.
Oh God, we're gonna have to disagree with you there.
But I think I would say that the land use control should probably come at the county first before we get to the metro.
Did you want to disagree with him on that?
Yeah, but I just thought, the history of the Dallas region's MPOs has been well documented.
Another thing that I want to...
It's a low bar, so they're doing sometimes. Although I would say our MPO has taken a lot of really positive steps forward, at least in my perspective.
Ours is getting better. I'm being a little bit too hard on them.
One of the things that I want to ask you is managed lanes, managed toll lanes. In North Texas, these are popping up all over. And you have, you're about to have the largest network of managed toll lanes in the country. And a lot of that, a huge reason for that is they were used as a way to fund transportation projects before Prop 1, before Prop 7, when there was even more so than now, a lot of limited funding for transportation projects. They're starting to pop up in other parts of the state. But a question I have is, what are the benefits of those besides helping fund a transportation project? How do those impact actual congestion, traffic flow, mobility?
Right. So what's interesting, and I'm going to date myself here, some of the early work that I did starting with TTI 20 years ago was working on priced lanes. In that, at that time it was HOV lanes in Houston were getting congested. They were losing their travel time advantage for the bus system, for the buses. So they were looking at changing the occupancy requirements and then allowing other vehicles to come in and pricing those so they can manage the demand. So back at that time, as they were starting out in California in the late 90s, and as they've moved through over the last several decades, primarily they were started as a way to improve traffic flow and efficiency, using a tool, market-based pricing, to do that. So with the notion that you're going to have a certain level of performance that you're going to maintain. So you're going to maintain 45 miles per hour all the time so that you can keep your buses moving. And really that's kind of where it started. But as we started running into the funding issues, that became the mechanism by which we would get these projects done, because you would generate revenue at the same time you were doing that pricing. What we've seen, we have 30 projects of this type around the country, more on the books that are planning. Communities are looking at these because as they grow, as population grows, as you get more demand on the system, you add more cars. You don't have an advantage for buses. You don't have a congestion relief valve, if you will, to allow buses and other kinds of vehicles to get where they need to go. The challenge, though, is you're talking about tolling. So people don't want to pay extra. And in these particular facilities, as congestion grows around it, on the regular lanes, the prices go up and up and up. And we're seeing in some parts of the country where prices are getting pretty high, and they're starting to see a backlash, in Florida in particular. So that's
Is
the
there
whole,
like a threshold where people, like a price point where people
like
like, no.
$10 a trip, that's when people start complaining,
That's
something
where they
around there.
start?
Well, that's where that's kind of it when we look at the case studies. So If it's truly market-based pricing, it should go up as high as it needs to in order to keep that flow going. But the question is, how high is too high?
Well, I was talking to one of the members of the Dream Team when he was in town, and he said that managed lanes are great, but nobody uses them right. He said if you wanted to solve congestion tomorrow, you don't build one more lane mile. You toll every lane, every highway, and you make it dynamic, so that the market then prices in how important it is for people to be there at 5:30. Because that's where the market has no say. Right now, it's the tragedy of the commons right now, is you've got a flood into these TxDOT facilities at the same time every day because we're humans and we all have to be in the same place at the same time. Kids go to school at the same time, all over the place. And so that was his idea, is that congestion is like that, easy, if you can market base the entire thing.
And that's what I was talking about earlier. You can use pricing as a tool to address demand. Is that politically acceptable is the other
I would say
side
no.
of that. Right.
Awesome. So we're going to go ahead and throw it to the audience and see what questions y'all have for the panelists. Yes, sir.
I was just going to ask, what barriers do you see, both on the political side and then also on the actual access to resource side, for increased multimodal, including, you talked about ride sharing, but also like Car2Go, and just having a plethora of options for you every time you step out of your office or your home or something like that.
So you
Go
want
ahead,
to start?
Ginger.
Yeah, I think as we've all talked about the funding challenges. So I think what we're starting to see are some new players in the transportation world, new types of services that are generated by the private sector, new business models. I think we're heading into an era of, different ways of collaborating between public and private sector and public sector to try to find out how these new business models and how these new modes can begin to address some of the challenges that we have.
Philip, I think the biggest barrier is racism. Earlier you were asking the high-speed rail folks about that Houston's station isn't going to go into downtown and has no plan for a link. And I'm like, yes, it does, bus. But nobody expects white people to ride the bus. And that's just how it is. We all want to ride these light rail things. That's why we're having this cotton belt fight up in our neck of the woods, because the suburbs want to have light rail access in our regional transit authority. And, bus just simply isn't good enough, I guess.
Well, I think it just depends on probably the individual jurisdiction and what type of transportation you're talking about. I know in Austin we have some jurisdictional challenges. We have a regional public transit provider, Capital Metro, for whom I worked for quite a while, and they have a very limited service area within the region. Their issue is that they aren't able to actually get funding very easily for the maintenance and operations of their service in some of the fastest growing parts of our region because they don't participate in the transit agency's sales tax funding. So that's a challenge, and I think that's a challenge for expanding public transportation regionally in a lot of different places in Texas. Although I think they've done, and I think we've done as a region, a good job of trying to get past those jurisdictional issues, because at the end of the day, people don't care. They don't see the boundary, as they're going over it. They just want to get to where they're going. I think each city's going to have its own challenges. You mentioned ride sharing. Austin famously, had a challenge earlier this year with regulation of our transportation network companies. I don't call them ride sharing. I call them transportation network companies or ride hailing. So I think every city is going to be different. Although I would say we still have lots of transportation network companies in Austin now. Actually, that's opened up the market. I got the numbers. I thought this might come up. Austin currently today has 9 TNCs operating, not Uber and Lyft, but 9 TNCs operating, 8,700 drivers. Almost all of them are fingerprinted. They will 100% be fingerprinted, and they hit their benchmarks. In the month of September, those TNCs delivered 483,102 rides. So TNCs are alive and well in Austin. So he's pulling up Ride Austin right now. So,
I don't live there.
but I think it's there's going to be challenges that crop up with funding, with the politics of it. But I think there's such a demand for transportation options, transportation choices. You know, as Ginger mentioned, you know, the political will follows public support. I think the public is asking for these options. And I don't think it's too long before those barriers are broken.
Awesome. Well, I don't want to hold up lunch any longer. I'm never one to do that. So I just want to thank y'all so much for being here. I really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank y'all.